All right. Welcome, everyone. I know it's been difficult to get here with weather. Those of us from New York had derailments in Penn Station, so I'm glad you're here. And then we came through the regulatory compliance gauntlet to get to the conference. So congratulations on getting here. So first of all, welcome. As you know, this is the final conference of CAPSEE, the Center for the Analysis of Post-Secondary Education and Employment. This was a 5-year center. It went for an additional year, so we really actually wrote this proposal in 2010. So it's interesting to think about what's happened since then. So before we get started there, I want to start out the conference with thanking the people who need to be thanked. So our main funder is the Institute for Education Sciences, Department of Education. James Benson is our program officer. I don't know if James is here, but thank you, James. The Spencer Foundation also supported this conference, and I have to say that we're providing food, and none of that food was paid for by federal funds, so it's important that you understand that. Certain people need to be thanked. I particularly want to thank Liz Carroll and Sarah Phillips, who organized this conference and did the logistics. Rena Park, who kind of put together the breakout sessions and got everybody to provide their slides. Other people who've helped out: Gladys Perez Mojica, Matilda Lombos, Lisa Ganga, Amy Mazzariello, Lisa Rothman, Sandy Spady, Doug Slater, Kim Maddox and Michael Oliver from Conference Direct, our conference organizers, and also really want to thank the Capitol Hilton and the PSAV staff who helped put this together. So thank you. This has been a lot of work, and people have really done a good job, and I think I and everybody else should really appreciate that. So thank you. All right, I think that it's a particularly good time to have this conference. The fundamental theme of the conference is the relationship between post-secondary education and employment, and really, I think those issues have really come to the fore. Even though we have lower unemployment, a high stock market, we really have a series of problems that have not been solved, that continue to plague us. We know that there's stagnant earnings for much of the population, incredible polarization in earnings and wealth in this country, continued significant gaps, equity gaps, but also I think certainly the last election has shown us and has made it clear the issues that anybody with low amounts of education, whatever their race, struggles in the economy that we have now. So I think that clearly there are supply side issues with many of those problems. What are the jobs, et cetera? But nevertheless, I think that almost everyone agrees that if there is a solution, and that education is going to play a significant part in that solution. So in many cases, the main themes that we're thinking about in this conference: is higher education worth it? Is it worth it for whom? How can we make the investment in higher education more effective? How can we eliminate the financial barriers that prevent many people from being able to make that investment? What are the institutional characteristics of colleges and universities that make them perform better? And what are the practices that those colleges have that will improve student outcomes, especially the outcomes for the types of students that we see struggle and that when they get into the labor market don't do so well. So I think those are the themes of the conference. I don't think there's a better time really to have those. They're profoundly important. So I hope that over the next 2 days we learn more about that, we engage with some of those, and particularly that we're inspired to go back and to answer many of the questions that we find haven't been answered. So welcome here, and I want I'm very happy that we've all been able to get together. Now let me just explain a little bit about CAPSEE. You know, CAPSEE was an alliance of several institutions. It was led at the Community College Research Center at Teachers College. The University of Michigan was also involved. NBR and Harvard, Dave Deming we'll hear from as well. Folks from UC Davis, led by McCall Kurlander. So those were the institutional partners that we had. Really, the fundamental thing that we did at CAPSEE was look at post-secondary transcripts and relate those to earnings using UI data. We did that in several states. So these are some of the issues that we confronted. But in addition, so we sort of had a series of states where we looked at education and we looked at the returns of that education in the labor market. But we also had a number of institutional programs and policies that we studied to improve outcomes, such as working while enrolled, financial aid, one-stop centers, and MSIs. So you'll see there's a series of projects. We had many states involved. These states that are in red were sort of the official CAPSEE partner states, but at CCRC and other folks working on this have experience in other states. So we've really been able to draw on research and data from a variety of states as well. So it's a very comprehensive set of projects. Certainly what we want to accomplish in the conference is, first of all, of course, to showcase the wonderful work that we've done, to really think about the overall implications and what is the state of research and knowledge about the relationship between post-secondary education and employment. Of course, we want to prompt further research questions. We've had a lot of experience working with large-scale data, so it's a very rich source of information. So we want to encourage the use of that. Certainly, one issue we ran into are limitations on data. So some of those are the types of things we'll think about. What about methodological issues? We are researchers, and there are issues, and so we've spent quite a bit of time thinking about the best way to accurately relate education to employment. So let me end with that and look just briefly at the conference format. We've stuffed a lot into this, so we really have 4 sessions. Students invest wisely in college. That's what we're going to talk about this morning. Basically, this afternoon's topic is going to be about financial aid and how we deal with those financial issues, the barriers to students. Tomorrow morning, we'll talk about institutional factors, and then we'll end up tomorrow afternoon by looking at practices of colleges to help students choose the right path to get on that will lead them to good employment. So I'm going to introduce our panel. I'm actually going to introduce them with one exception in the order that they're going to go. Clive will start, but I'll introduce him last. I think you know most of these folks. I'll be very brief. You can read their long bios if you want. So Tony Carnevale is the research professor and director of the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce, of course, a go-to source for information on many of these issues. Catherine Rampell writes a twice-weekly nationally syndicated opinion column for the Washington Post and frequently covers economics, public policy, politics, and culture with an emphasis on data-driven journalism. And Jim Jacobs is the president of Macomb Community College since 2008. Before that, he was the associate director of the Community College Research Center, and I think it's fair to say that really at CCRC kind of set up our thinking about the relationship between education and work particularly. Finally, the first person to speak is Clive Belfield, who's a professor in the Department of Economics at Queens College at CUNY, City University of New York. Now, of course, Clive, in this context, is much more important. Clive has worked closely with us in CAPSEE, and I particularly want to thank Clive because he really designed the content of this conference and put it together. So if you like it, and I'm sure you will, we've already gotten a lot of compliments on the content, and I think that very much that Clive deserves the credit for that. So with that, Clive. Oh, by the way, just one. Sorry, you have, I should have said this. You have a Wi-Fi on there. Of course, nobody's going to use it, right? Because you're all going to be paying attention and not on your email, but there is a Wi-Fi there. So, Clive, sorry.
Thank you, Tom. So, I'd like to just briefly review the evidence that we've collected over the last 6 years and talk about the labor market returns to some college. Now, some college is the group of students who mostly start at community college and either complete or do not complete. There are students also who have BAs, but who start at four-year colleges, but I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to talk about the group which most labor market data sets call some college. Now, start with a bit of context. We're really not super worried about people who get BA degrees. And there's a lot of evidence that the returns to a BA degree are extremely high. The lifetime earnings gain for getting a BA is at least $400,000. That's after you've adjusted for the cost of college. So we're not super worried about people who get BAs. We're really worried about people who start at community college and whether they finish and what skills they get and what jobs they get. So as Tom mentioned, one of the agendas for CAPSEE was to identify labor market returns for community college students, and we used large-scale data for this. We used full transcripts from colleges across a statewide system. We had information on where they transferred to and how long they were in the transfer college and if they got an award at the transfer college. And we have quarterly earnings data for each individual before they go to college, while they're in college, and after they leave college from UI records. And the states that we were working in, and also other states that have adopted this method, are listed there. There are a number of states. I'm going to report on as many as I can pull together systematically. Now, the method here is to think of a student who is moving along through time, and then they have a set of characteristics which are going to influence how productive they are in the labor market, and then they're going to have a wage before college, in college, and then after college. And what we're interested in is estimating the wage after they leave college. It's easiest to see this in a figure. So this is an earnings trajectory for a typical community college student who ends up with an associate's degree. And so they start college there. Before college, their earnings are pretty flat. In this example, which is Ohio data, the earnings are going upwards a little bit, and then when you go into college, your earnings go down, and they stay kind of flat for a few quarters, 8 quarters, 12 quarters, and then they start to go up. This is the average for an associate's degree completer. If you look at somebody who doesn't complete community college, starts in community college but does not complete, you get a trajectory that looks like that, which not only is a lot lower than the associate's degree trajectory, looks extremely flat, extremely flat. And what we're interested in estimating, for the most part, is this gap here, these gaps between associate degrees and non-completers. And what I'm going to report is kind of the average of that gap. I'm following these students, these people all the way through, up to 44 quarters in some case. So I've got lots of gaps at points in time, and I'm going to take the average of those gaps. And when I do that, I get a conclusion which is pretty comforting. Relative to not completing, earnings gains for associate degree completers, so these are relative to people who go to community college but do not complete, these returns appear to be high, durable, so that is to say they last over time. They're robust. I'm going to talk about that in a breakout, so I'm not going to talk about that here. And they are consistent. And consistent is very helpful for us because we have, there's a graph of a figure of the alpha coefficients. Some of them are mushed together for the different states. I threw in a few other studies where I could make these comparable. These are 2015 dollars, so this is about $2,000 for North Carolina females and $1,800 for Kentucky males. The nice thing about this figure is that it is consistent. These numbers are pretty close together. Now, that is very helpful because there were about 6 different teams of economists working in 6 different states. So given that they are economists, 6 different teams, you would expect at least 9 different answers. And it turns out we got 9 different answers that were all the same. 9 different answers. These are pretty close together, given that there are some differences. I've harmonized the numbers so there's no inflation issues and there's not a time difference issue here. Roughly speaking, quarterly earnings gains are about $6,500 for each female. These are reasonably young people, and there are some zeros in there. And the earnings gain, that gap, is about $1,800 per person. So that's a pretty big gap. That's like 25%, something like that. For males, males are earning more than the females, and they have a pretty big gap too, but that gap is slightly smaller than the females, so about $1,200. So pretty high returns, consistent returns, and so that's a comforting result for people who think that associate degree completion is a desirable goal. Now, we have a lot of people getting certificates in our data sets, and the earnings gains for certificates are not as high as for associate's degrees. Again, this is relative to somebody who doesn't complete. So we describe the earnings gain to certificates as positive for the most part, but varied across states and fields of study, and also somewhat temporary for a certificate holder. So if I compare the earnings trajectory for community college starters, the purple line is some people with certificates look like the purple line relative to the non-completers, so they have a reasonable earnings gain, but there are a number of certificate holders whose earnings trajectory looks like that, which, given that you've had to go to college and you've got that dip there around 0, and you've stayed in college for longer, some of those certificates are not going to be high value. So the returns to certificates are not as promising as for associate's degrees, and when I estimate those gaps between certificate holders and non-completers, I get numbers across the states which in some cases cross 0. So now it's important to mention here that these are certificates relative to students who go to community college. So everybody's going to community college. Some complete a certificate, some complete no award at all. In some cases, the people with no award might actually have been in college longer than the person with a certificate, but they don't have an award. So across the estimates that we have, the earnings for females is about $6,500. The average gain for a certificate holder is about $740 for a female certificate holder and $530 for male certificate holders. So not a large amount, and we're not sure how long that lasts for either. Now, those are the awards. What about just staying in college? We have estimates of the returns to credits, and we find that more credits are associated with higher earnings, so there's a gap there. It's approximately monotonic, that is to say 10 credits is better than 5 credits, almost double, but there is some return to completing the award. So there is some benefit to just staying in college longer. Now, unambiguously, there are returns to health fields and vocational awards which are especially strong. And this is something that we've known for a while, but really jumps out in these analyses. The returns to a general associate's degree in arts appear to be no better than completing an award. In almost every study that we have, the field which is the highest earning, the field with the highest earnings is health nursing, allied health. So every study, you look by field, what do the students do? The ones with the health and nursing awards do much better than others. And in fact, even if I just look at CTE, so career technical education, these are the gains for career and technical education completers over non-completers. And you can see there that in IT, there's not much of a gain for completing your award in the IT field, but the big gain in earnings is if you complete a health award. So this is something that we've known for a while, but really jumps out in these data sets, the returns to health. Conclusion number 5. We think the returns are broadly incremental. We try to emphasize incremental because a lot of people have talked about the variation in returns, but a lot of that variation is a consequence of more or better quality education. So that's called the incremental hypothesis, the idea that the variation is caused by a greater level of investment in college. And we see that for most of our studies. So those are the incremental quarterly earnings gains. If you have 10 credits, you get something over 0 credits. If you have a certificate, you get a slightly higher return, a diploma, higher return, associate degree, higher return, and then those who go on to get BAs get a much larger return. So we see this as an incremental hypothesis which we need to distinguish from the idea of variation. Now, we can look a little deeper into what these students are doing, and when we do that, we see a number of things about their early trajectory over through college, before college, through college, and after college. And what we notice is that the people who complete are doing something rational. They are deliberately scaling back their labor market activity while they're in college much faster than people who don't complete. So the people who don't complete are often not going to college as intensively as they probably should. We also see that a lot of the students are not giving up a lot of work when they go into college. A lot of them are still working, and they're maybe working less hours, but their opportunity cost of going to college appears to be quite low. They're not giving up their jobs in the classical way that you would expect them to. Now, unfortunately, one of the things we notice is that the completers rack up a lot more credits than they really needed to. And so typically, the completers have about 70 credits instead of 60 credits, which is what you need for the degree. The non-completers have about 20 credits, so the non-completers are a long way behind the completers. They're not very close, and even though they think they've got 20 credits, so they're a third of the way there, in practical terms, they're not a third of the way there because completion typically takes more than 60 credits. We also find that the returns grow slightly over the time period that we are looking at for associate degree holders. All mostly good news. If we look at some of the things that we might be worried about in using this information, we find that marginal students, those right on the edge who probably are worried about whether they should go to college or not, maybe they have a low GPA or maybe they're going to get put into remediation, that doesn't appear to make a lot of difference to the returns to college. So the idea that these are averages which do not apply to marginal students, there's not a huge amount of evidence for that. A lot of our data comes from during the Great Recession, and the Great Recession was a huge disturbance to the labor market. We find that the disturbance to the labor market doesn't really make too much of a difference in our results. So there's some... I think they're just going to grab me next and just pull me off. I've nearly finished, guys. Okay, now so the Great Recession does not appear to have done much to our results. The IT technology slowdown, the idea that you're no longer using a big machine anymore, you're using a very small amount of capital, that may have halted the growth in earnings gaps. I say may because I don't think it has, but it may have done that. In conclusion, the CAPSEE consensus seems to be that at least if we're talking about people who start at community college, there are pretty positive returns, especially in vocational fields. These appear to be incremental, more is better. They appear to be robust, at least across most fields and most states and colleges, and they appear to be broadly responsive to the macroeconomic trends that we've seen. And Tom likes things that rhyme, so we have a CAPSEE constant, and I think the CAPSEE constant is that relative to not completing, an associate degree holder will have about $1,500 more per quarter than a non-completer. And then I guess we end with a CAPSEE conundrum. These show us what economists have usually known, which is the rate of return to human capital is pretty strong, pretty positive, pretty robust. So why aren't people doing more of it? And that's really something that we have to explain as we do future work. Thank you so much.
trying to figure out what I can say that everybody in this audience doesn't already know. Usually I speak to audiences that don't already know more than I do, but this is not one of those. I think the point I would like to make is more as much an historical one and a political one as it is one about the relationship between education and the economy. I think over the past 30 years, over the past 10 to 15 for educators, but consistently for everybody else, especially people who are trying to talk to the American public, that the lesson is the same throughout, and that is the job's the thing. All the other stuff is really secondary, unless it comes to health care and other elements of the welfare state. But in the United States, the job's the thing, more so than in most other nations, because the job is what drives your welfare in our system, whereas stronger welfare states in other parts of the world have much more to do with quality of life and so on. So that we find when we run American numbers on education against things like healthcare, crime, except white-collar crime does increase with education. Education makes white-collar crime more profitable, as the researchers have found, and as we see all around us. And in the end, they're meeting down the hall. There's a big meeting on infrastructure with even more old white guys than you see up on this stage. But there is in the end, that's the key to this story. And it's a story that for Americans has turned out relatively happily. And that is, if this were the 1970s, we'd be standing here in great fear as we lost manufacturing jobs to the Japanese and Germans. As we all agreed, and I was one of them, I worked for the AFL-CIO in those days, who was worried that we were going to have to make a living taking in each other's wash. We were all going to get McJobs once the high productivity manufacturing jobs disappeared. So we fought that, fought trade. There was lots of talk about deindustrialization, and Senator Kennedy even challenged Jimmy Carter on the basis of his proposals for reindustrialization. So we're living that story, and a major part of that story, and what is really very different between the 70s and now, is that in the 70s, 2/3 of the workers had high school or less, and they were doing just fine, and happy about the fact that they didn't have to go to school beyond high school. Because when you ask workers, and I've been in rooms many times when this comes up, there's always somebody who wants to bring the education or training solution for a jobs problem. And I can remember being with a boss of mine in Maine when we were talking about shutting down one of our shipbuilding yards. And the discussion was him getting up and talking about how he'd fight to keep it open, and then him calling on his staff guy, me, to stand up and talk about CETA, the Comprehensive Employment and Retraining Act, which was going to save all those hard-working Mainers. The room went very silent, and as we walked out the door, he said to me, "We just screwed up." And I said, "Why?" He said, "You just told them all they're going to be fired. And they don't care about training or education. They don't want either. What they want is a job." We saw that in this last presidential contest. Sanders and Clinton, the Democrats, the party of the meritocrats, the party of higher education, of college-educated workers, they proposed free college. It worked with their base. The other guy proposed jobs, and he won the white-collar working class. And if it were not for the loyalties of minorities to the Democrats, I think he would have won them too. So the message in all of this is always jobs. And what you're hearing today, and what CAPSEE has done brilliantly over the past several years, is to bring these two ideas together, jobs and education. Educators resist this. They do so because they believe, quite rightly, that the purpose of education is not to create foot soldiers for American capitalism, that the purpose of education in a democratic society is human flourishing. But of course, the other reality intervenes, and that is in a democratic society with a capitalist market-based economy. If you can't get a job, it's very hard to participate fully or develop fully as a human being. You can be very well educated, but you're not going to be developed very well if you're living under a bridge. You won't be a lifelong learner if you're not a lifelong earner. That lesson comes home over and over and over again. And it is one that is just being learned in American education and resisted mightily by American higher education for fear that they will lose Shakespeare. So in the end, that is the message of this conference and the summary of the work that's been done by CAPSEE and a lot of us over the past several years. The remarkable thing about this is that in the 80s, it turned out, after the 80-81 recession, when we were all pretty gloomy, because the manufacturing jobs were going, Volcker and Carter started the 80-81 recession because we couldn't beat inflation, so the way they figured to do that was to take money out of workers' pockets. That would bid down prices, so we fired the American workforce, especially the industrial workforce. And it turned out that made a great deal of sense in economic terms, because we added in technology, huge investments, structural change, massive increases in productivity, and the productivity boom in the industrial sector afforded us a service economy. And the education sector nowadays is largely about becoming the workforce development system, the personnel operation for a post-industrial service economy. That's where educated workers go now. They don't do much heavy lifting, and they tend to work indoors. So there is a story here that really is a story about the United States and its attempt to balance democratic values with capitalism. And education is now part of that bargain. It's not just about educators anymore. So we're very lucky that happened, because I can tell you that at least among most of the economists that I palled around with in the 1970s, we didn't believe that was going to happen. So in the end, what did happen is a massive restructuring of the economy, the use of technology, technology-biased, skill-biased technology change, in the end produced demand for a workforce that had more than high school. And we saw some remarkable things since. That is, we doubled and almost tripled the stock of workers with college in the American workforce, and at the same time, we doubled their relative compensation, relative to high school, the college wage premium. Usually in economics, when you triple supply, you don't double value. You reduce cost and value. Much the same thing is true of the AA and true of a whole variety of more highly specific kinds of education and training that have grown since and that we're hearing about today in this particular CAPSEE study. So there were two things that happened in the 80s after 83. And that is, number one, the wage premium for college doubled, even though we tripled the supply of college-educated workers. That then validated, and I think continues to validate, the American model, which is the hybrid education that includes 30 to 40% in a college major. Nowadays, 80% of those majors are in fields connected directly to occupations. 20% are in social science, humanities, and the softer fields. We doubled the value of degrees. We proved, and the evidence continues, although it's thin, the evidence continues to roll in that the combination of specific and general education is still the best way to go, that it produces longer-term labor market participation for people who get it, that it satisfies all sorts of other basic needs in a society, that is the combination of specific and general learning, also increases health care, increases civic participation, reduces blue-collar crime, increases white-collar crime. That's my favorite finding. And in the end, that's why I wear blue shirts. In the end, that fact is something that we're still struggling with, because there is a movement afoot, and it's very strong, and it's hard to disagree with it, to build post-secondary education into job training, as the educators would say in panic. In the end, I suspect that won't work. I think in the end, we should be committed to a system that provides people both general and specific education. that allows them to fulfill themselves and flourish as human beings in a democracy, and also allows them to make a living. Because if educators don't prepare people to make a living in a market economy, they cannot fulfill their other obligations to the culture, society, and the development of individuals. So in the end, I think that's where we're headed. I heard this morning that in many cases we're seeing very narrow certificates, AAs, and technical degrees, badges, stacked certificates, and so on and so forth, and all the new animals in the zoo, and there'll be many more, because the for-profit schools are coming back with a vengeance. So but in the end, what we're finding is that traveling from there to the BA has enormous benefits for people. So not only is that good news for Georgetown, where I work, but I think it's also good news for the American population on the whole. The issue is, how are we going to pay for that? We simply don't have the money. And so the efficiency of this system to provide both general and specific education is the core issue. We have two major service industries that don't perform well: healthcare and education. We're going to have to find ways to unbundle value, build modern management systems, which have already taken over all the other industries, modern management systems that are essentially networks. In the case of education, networks at the program level, not the institutional level, because what we're finding is the institution matters less and less and less, and the program matters more and more and more. But institutions, networks of program-level education and training treatments tied to clearly measured outcome standards. The easiest outcome standard to measure is wages, hours worked, or employment, and if we could get occupation on the wage record data, we could measure career pathways as well. I think that's where we're going in the next 10 to 15 years. It's already well on the way. Essentially, that check is in the mail. There's wide agreement on both sides of the aisle that we need to get more efficiency and productivity out of our education system, in many ways similar to what we're trying to do in healthcare. So with this new game, which is that education drives opportunity more and more, there are new rules. Rule number one is the old-time religion still obtains. Getting a mixed education that is both specific and general, and it doesn't matter which comes first. Getting an education that is both specific and general is still pretty much a sure thing. More education is still better than less education. On average, a graduate degree makes more than a BA, makes more than a AA, makes more than a certificate. Industry-based certifications are the curveball in the game because they mostly go to people who already have degrees. So there is a clear indication that the longer-term value of general and specific education in combination and its immediate effects on human lives, in part because it drives higher incomes that allows you to buy health care and makes robbing a candy store inefficient, robbing a bank more efficient. But in the end, there are huge income effects, but there is a socialization effect in education that does all sorts of good things for people, like getting them to vote. And as the Republicans will tell you, if you go to the BA, it makes them vote like Democrats, which is a problem. So I think in the end, we've stumbled into a good situation there. But the second fact is the one that is most difficult for educators, and that is that what we saw since '83 was a doubling of the BA wage premium over high school, but what we also saw was a quadrupling of the differences in earnings by field of study, and that is by far the more significant finding. What it means is, rule number two is, what you take determines what you make. And then there are other rules. There's a third rule which says, in the end, because of differences in earnings by field of study, principally, sometimes less education is worth more. More than 40% of BAs make more than the average graduate degree, more than 30% of AAs make more than the average BA. There are certificates that make more than the average BA, and in some cases, mostly female-dominated graduate degrees in early childhood education and the like make more than a fair share of the graduate degrees. So it is a system now that is both driven by the demands of specific and general learning. The difficulty we face is that we've built a system in which the general learning increasingly goes to white people who have parents with bank accounts. Something on the order of 75 to 80% of all the new white college students since 1994 are going to the top 500 four-year colleges. On something on the order of 75% of the new Latino and African American students entering the system are getting job training. They're going to the open admission four-year college, but even more so to the two-year college system, and they're slipping rapidly into certificates and sub-AA kinds of training. And so we're building a dual system, a la Germany, of our own. The issue there is to ensure that there is equal opportunity to progress to the BA. I think that really is the longer-term challenge. It also brings the economists back around in agreement with the educators, which will be a happy moment when it occurs. In any event, thank you and have a good conference.
So I'm a journalist, not an academic, which means I am not an expert. I see my job as translating the experts, as making academic research more accessible to the general public. That's part of my mission. I do my best, but I don't always succeed. I can't reach everyone. And I'm here to talk about oops, there we go. Nope. How do I get to my? Keep going. Keep going, sorry. Here we go, sorry. I'm here to talk about the many myths, misperceptions, and half-truths about higher education, as evidenced by the many angry emails I get. And there are tons and tons of myths, as I'm sure you know, and many of them are very persistent. I could go through, probably 20, many revolving around the fact that people believe that college students today are all 18 to 22-year-old childless adults, going around in toga parties, sort of more Animal House style. But I'm going to focus on a few. I think I have 5 of them here today, that many of them fall broadly into the category of like kids these days stereotypes. So let's talk about the first one here, which is that it's easy to work your way through college, meaning that financial aid, whether you're getting it from your parents or the institution or the federal government through a loan or a grant, is only for leeches and layabouts. And you may have heard this as well. It is true that labor force participation of college-enrolled, or school-enrolled students has fallen over time. It's a little bit hard to read on this chart, but basically in the 80s, it was around 60%. Today, it's closer to about 50%, so it has declined. It is true that fewer people who are enrolled in school are working. This is for age 20 to 24, and from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Are any of you familiar with the old Economy Steve meme? Does this ring a bell? Okay, so there's this meme that, you know what memes are, right? They're like, okay, you got that. There's this meme of this like boomer generation, older guy yelling at kids these days, and here's one of them. When I was in college, my summer job paid the tuition. Yeah, but tuition was $400. It wasn't exactly $400, but we do have some data looking at how the relative value of working has changed over time, working at minimum wage jobs versus what it costs to go to school. And this actually comes courtesy of Sandy Baum, who I think may be here. Hi, Sandy. And who had sent me this data recently as part of the Urban Institute's recent college affordability website, which is awesome. You should all look at it. So what we're looking at here is basically what it what you would earn if you're working part-time during the school year and full-time during breaks, summer vacation, if you're working minimum wage. And so that is, my printout is in black and white. Let's see. That is the blue line. And you can see that back in the 70s, what you could earn through that kind of work schedule was about equal to what you would have to pay for tuition fees, room and board at a public four-year institution. Roughly equivalent. Today, of course, the minimum wage is worth much less, and college costs much more. So, in fact, whereas before you could roughly pay for not only going to college, but also living expenses, like room and board, today you can't even pay for tuition. So the tuition line is the red line, tuition and fees, and then is it green on there, it looks like? The green line is everything combined. So it doesn't come close to adding up. And I should clarify that these are published numbers. They're not net numbers. The net tuition numbers don't go back that far. But you get roughly a sense of how much more difficult it has become to pay your way through college, which might be part of the reason why there are a lot of voters who are resistant to the idea of providing more subsidies to today's higher education students, right? Because they haven't realized that these numbers have changed. Okay. Myth number 2, most college grads can't find jobs, or if they can, they all stink. They're all working at Starbucks, for example. Everybody's underemployed. And as we know, this is wrong. So here from the New York Fed, they have also a wonderful source for looking at the returns to higher education, particularly unemployment and underemployment of college grads. They have data showing the unemployment rates for all college graduates age 22 to 65 and also recent college graduates. So those are the ones who are supposed to be working at Starbucks. And as you can see, all college graduates are at like 2.5% unemployment rate, whereas recent college graduates are about 4%. Hard to imagine that these are all, that these anecdotes that you hear about all these recent grads living in their parents' basements because they can't find jobs, et cetera, that they're actually unemployed. The data do not bear that out. And actually, if you compare it to all workers, recent college grads are doing better than all workers. All workers have like about a 5% right now unemployment rate. And then if you compare that to the same age group, age 22 to 27, without a BA, it's way higher than everybody else. So clearly, this perception that students shouldn't even bother going to college because they're not going to get a job anyway is misguided. Now, what about underemployment rates? So this is again from the New York Fed, and you can see that so these are underemployment here. I mean, it's very hard to define generally. You hear this term a lot. I think in this particular instance, they're looking at whether people are in jobs that are not supposed to require a degree. And you can see that a lot of college graduates have been in these jobs, college graduates basically of all ages. But the share of them in jobs that supposedly don't require bachelor's degrees has been roughly flat, like in the mid-30s since 1990. The share of bachelor's degree recipients who are in these jobs who are younger, who are recent grads, that number has bounced around a little bit, but it's not really that different today than from what it was in the 90s. So it's hard, again, this perception that suddenly we have this surge of useless college degrees that can't get people jobs or can't get people jobs outside of a grocery store or Starbucks is misguided. And again, the same, you can also look at similar data for wages. So the blue line here is the bachelor's degree wages. And for recent, again, this is all for recent college graduates. I think it's yellow on the chart. The yellow line here is for high school diploma recipients of the same age. These are medians. And then the gray shading around that is for the 25th to the 75th percentile. And so you can see, again, even the 25th percentile recent college graduate is earning more than the median high school graduate. Doesn't mean it's causal, of course. There are selection issues, but this perception that these people can't get jobs, they can't get jobs better than their classmates from high school who didn't go on to college is wrong, whatever the mechanism behind it. The next one, this is my favorite one. The reason the jobs stink, you know, you're assuming myth number 2 is correct, they do stink, is that everyone majors in women's studies. And I get this all the time. I don't know why. I don't know if there's like a persistent segment on Fox News where they talk about this, but I hear this all the time. But it's not always women's studies. Sometimes it's like dance or art history or, you know, basket weaving or whatever. And it is true, as we have heard, that there is a dispersion in labor market outcomes depending on what you major in. And students may not realize that they're leaving money on the table if they want to make more money because they're majoring in art history or whatever. Not that money is the only objective. There's great value to studying the humanities. I don't know about basket weaving, but some of these other subjects, I don't mean to imply that jobs are the only thing that matter. Here's another one of these memes that's sort of in the same category. I don't know if this one has a name. It's not like Old Economy Steve, but in any case, it's the same idea. So I looked at the data for this, and I've sent these numbers to readers on occasion. So in the 2014-2015 school year, this is from Education Department data, there were 1.9 million bachelor's degrees awarded. Of those, only about 1,000 were for women's studies. In fact, if you combine all area, ethnic, cultural, gender group studies, so, you know, queer studies, African American studies, whatever, even then, that's less than 8,000 degrees, which is, the numbers were about 0.4% of the total. Visual and performing arts degrees were about 96,000, and that includes art history. And that's only about 5% of the total. I don't have stats on basket weaving, but actually there is a category called fiber, textile, and weaving arts, and there were 187 degrees. So I need to go find those people and write a profile of them, probably. And if you want to look at the distribution of degrees awarded over time, you can see that there have been changes since the 70s. So I'm showing some of these here. Hopefully you can read them. That bottom group, humanities, has actually fallen, and that category is what includes women's studies and ethnic studies and all of that. That's how they're categorized in this data set. And then you can see that there have been declines in some of these other groups. Education has gone way down. Computer sciences, I believe, has gone down a little bit, and computer science, or no, excuse me, that's gone up a couple of percentage points. So there have been some changes in the distribution, but, you know, among the biggest gainers are things that should be practical, right? If we're talking about students being much less practical today than they used to be, business has surged. There's been a huge increase in the share of degrees that are awarded for business, and then other fields. So other fields includes lots of things, but many of them are sort of the more practical ones. Health professions, law enforcement, journalism. I'm not sure that's so practical, but I think students think it's practical. So anyway, you can see that the numbers don't exactly correspond to what the public believes the choices that students are making are. The next one is about debt. So this is the idea that the average new grad has like 40 grand in debt. And yes, you can find these people. I've written about them, in fact. And so maybe I'm part of the problem. But there is this perception that they represent all college graduates and that these people are never going to be able to pay this funding back. So here is also from the Urban Institute's College Affordability site, and you can see the distribution of how much debt recent graduates have. And for all graduates, the share that have over $40,000 in debt is like 18%. It's small. It's not everyone. In fact, 30% have no debt at all upon graduation. And there's, you know, a lot of variation depending on the student and what school they go to, of course. But once again, this idea of this iconic student who has $40,000, $50,000 in debt is not accurate. You are more likely to see them, however, if they went to a for-profit school, which I'm sure all of you know. You know, the types of students who go there and the funding models for those schools are different. So my last one is about climbing walls. Again, I hear this all the time from readers, that the reason why tuition has become more expensive is because of all these frivolities that schools are providing, climbing walls, lazy rivers, that sort of thing. And yes, again, there are some like flagship schools or other schools that are trying to attract more students because through these kinds of perks, but as I'm sure you know, this is not the model. And particularly in public colleges, if you look at the numbers, a large part of the reason why tuition has gone up is that funding has gone down. Public funding has gone down. As one public college president put it, our school used to be state funded and then it was state sponsored and now it's just state located. But if you look at this chart, it's basically showing the top bars, the green bars are tuition revenue, and the blue ones are funding from the state. And basically every time there's a recession, funding is cut, and it recovers somewhat during a recovery, but not necessarily fully, and tuition has to make up the balance. So it's not climbing walls, it's that, you know, somebody has to be bearing the cost of these students' education, and if we used to consider it a public good, it's now more of a private good. You know, it's the burden of that cost is borne more by the students. So anyway, thank you so much.
Well, first, let me say a thank you to CAPSEE on behalf of the many community college people in the audience. I know at least a few of you eagerly wait for the papers to come out, and to see the research that CAPSEE has done is really helps us a great deal on the ground. It also stimulates us to do our own little research projects and think through on an institutional level some of the issues that have been raised by the panelists today and the work of CAPSEE in general. So what I'm going to report upon is really a very modest little, what I call research action project that really stems from the work that we do on the level of the community college. And it starts with a paradox, and Tony sort of put this, I think, in a national framework, but we can look at it locally. Macomb Community College plays a big role with the auto industry. We get lots of people jobs, and during the Great Recession in 2010, we had over 3,400 adults, and we consider the, quote, non-traditional student, the adult student, age 24 and up, in our programs. And now as the automobile industry, so we had 3,400 adults in our programs, as the automobile industry now begins to rebound and expand, our actual adult enrollment is dropping. And where adults used to provide 39% of our total credit courses, now it's down to 30%. And this is a trend that exists not just at Macomb, but in most community colleges. Adult students are not coming to the community colleges for credit classes. And this is the paradox. At the same time, the economy is increasing in its job production, and of course, as many of the economists in the room know, the skills gap is a sort of, as one economist put it, a kind of high-level wine that exists among most employers. They can't seem to find people, et cetera. Yet we can't seem to get adults to come back to school. So we wanted to kind of explore that paradox a little bit at Macomb Community College. And what we did is we went to our customers. We do a great deal of work with manufacturing firms in the auto industry. And we started to, ask them this question. What's going on with your programs? Why And these are companies that have used Macomb for apprenticeship programs, for customized training, for for-credit programs. What's going on inside of your companies that are making, utilizing us as an institution much less? And what we found is by looking at some of these companies, over 40% of the companies that we had dealt with had eliminated their educational benefit programs during the Great Recession, that as part of their survival mechanisms to continue their own operations, they simply eliminated many of the internal operations that they had. What that then we began to realize is that we have lost a kind of relationship, and that this issue of skills gap and what it looks like on the ground, on the local level, is that there really is a very inefficient allocation of both the skill needs of employers and the ability of educational institutions to respond to them. And I think this question of, it's not even an economic question, it's almost a cultural question of how people see, in companies, how people see their skill needs and how able they are to articulate them and how well we are as educators to try to respond to them. So we began then to look at our own programs, and what did we find? So first, as I mentioned, the issue of our own companies had eliminated programs. The second that we also clearly see is that many adults do come back to school, but they come back to school for very short-term job training programs. That those programs, at least in our institution, continue to grow. So the question became for us how we can utilize those short-term job training programs, because as Tony, I think, put it, this is what attracts people to the college, adults, and think about how we could take what Peter Barr from the University of Michigan is going to talk about probably later, skill builders, people who are coming with specific courses, and see if we could extend those specific courses into some programs that at some point would begin to turn into credit programs. So we started with some of our Department of Labor grants, and we actually began to pack into those Department of Labor grants first foundation skills, basic skills in English and math and communication skills. We second began to pack into these programs certifications, so that the actual short-term training, which was attracting people to the college, was beginning to expand into actual almost regular, looking like credit classes. The third is that we began to see that question of how one, even though Macomb and like many other community colleges now integrates credit and non-credit education, we really hadn't seen the non-credit side of the organization as a place to market the credit courses and to set up, and we began to set up internally articulation agreements between the non-credit courses, that if adults continued to come and move to the credit side, we would institutionally give credits for their non-credit work at our own institutions. Fourth, we also began to see that even though, like many of the colleges in this room, Macomb played a role in achieving the dream, we're a leadership college, et cetera, almost all our work in the area of student success assumed younger students. We actually didn't develop career pathways for people going part-time. We didn't see that as even though the majority of our adults are part-time students. So we began to change the way in which our program sequences started to work. Fourth, a lot of our work in achieving the dream was with the help of CCRC and other grants that we got from foundations, to really redesign our registration system, to make sure that our orientation was very robust for students, that they understood a community college, what we did, et cetera, et cetera. In the surveys of our adults, we found that they not only didn't like that, they found it, in fact, an inhibitor to them registering, because they knew what they want. And why did they have to go through all this stuff that prevented them from getting registered? And it's an interesting issue that adults come to the school in a very different way than younger people. And so we're thinking about whether we need a different kind of registration system to move adults from the non-credit side to the credit side for long-term gains. Fifth, even though we had extensive relationships with four-year institutions, many of whom offer classes on our campus, and we even have a medical school on one of our campuses, the four-year institutions were not really designing programs or developing ways in which adults who proceeded into our credit programs could move into a bachelor's degree. And I think, again, something that Tony said is very important, that these are individuals who can and should come back to school for a job, but as they look at their careers and whether they can move upward in that workspace, they're going to need a four-year degree. And how we kind of market that is important. In light of this, we also, again, as many of you who have researched Pell know, adults, even though they use Pell, are often not aware of Pell unless it's explained to them, are often not in a position. There are very few scholarships that our foundation gets from employers that are concentrated around adult learners. And the whole issue of financial aid and how to finance one's career becomes, I think, an important, kind of question. Sixth, among some of our new immigrant groups that are coming to our college, we began also to start thinking about how co-generational learning strategies might begin to work. That is, the children of some of our new immigrants, and in our case, they're Chaldeans, Yemeni, and Bengalis, are coming to the schools through the high school and coming to the college, but often to see our job training programs and our short-term credit programs as ways of attracting, adults and families who could come together. And then finally, two other important, I think, points. In talking with adults and talking about whether they would want to go into credit programs, what began to be clear is adults didn't really like the counseling aspect, but they were looking for coaches. They were looking for people who had done what we were asking them to do, and how the experience of mentors and the experience of coaches could actually encourage more adults to return to school, because they can see that others like themselves in their own situation were able to do that. And finally, and I think this is again a kind of interesting policy issue, if we look at America's College Promise, and we look at the good work that's been done around the country in this area, most of it focuses on younger people. Most of it focuses on people moving out of high school into 2 years of a community college. We began to think, and we're trying to figure out how to do this, to work with our local companies and to really start to think of the first 2 years of a community college as an important way in which a first job is earned, or a career is started or restarted for adults as well. So with that, this is our little modest effort. We think this issue is a major question for community colleges, and I think we can put it in somewhat of a kind of a political framework. For many adults, when faced with jobs or school, they are now, at this point at least, picking jobs, assuming that the jobs are going to be there. And again, you know, when you look at a county like Macomb County, where you have large numbers of adults without any college education whatsoever, they're much more likely to gravitate towards people who will say, you know, we're going to bring those jobs back, we're going to create, you know, work for you. And less likely to see us when we talk about how we can, you know, come back to school, learn some more skills, and, you know, we'll get you a you know, better job. So this issue of adults and the response of community colleges is not just an economic issue. It's also, I think, a societal question and certainly a political question. Thank you.
All right, thank you. This was an unusual panel because everybody was on time. So we have time for questions. There are, I can't see them, but I'm told there are microphones. There's one there and over there. So if you have a question, why don't you go to the microphone? I have some questions myself if so. Michael.
Michael Collins, Jobs for the Future. You know, a lot of the post-secondary work that we do is focused on the sub-baccalaureate. And a lot of what I'm hearing is really around the importance of the 4-year. So given that so many students coming into community colleges are underprepared and have life circumstances that are really dire, you know, the implications for persisting to a 4-year, it just seems really daunting. So what are we to do with people who are coming into community colleges, not college proficient in all subject areas, living in really rough kind of economic conditions? I mean, how are we to have a conversation about bachelor's degrees for those individuals? I'd just like to see how we get from there to what you are suggesting is optimal. I don't disagree. I'm just having a hard time getting from where the students are to this, this BA. So any number of you.
Well, I think in the end, what we've done, and everybody in this room has been part of this, and the momentum in this effort will continue, which is to attach education to jobs, in part because it makes sense. Education got attached to jobs after 1983. Where I face this is in work that I do on boards that deal with disadvantaged kids and in dealing with disadvantaged kids personally, face to face. You're always confronted by somebody who sits down in front of you, oftentimes in high school or in college, but they're in trouble. That is, they don't know what their next step is. So, and this has a lot to do with whether we reinstate vocational education in high school, which we're about to do, I think. I think the momentum is there to do that again and moving relatively fast. So the issue gets to be tracking. So we're going to have BAs for rich white kids, and we're going to have AAs and job training for black kids, Latinos, working class white kids, and so on. That's a problem. Now, we've sort of made a deal with each other, also beginning in '83 with the Nation at Risk report, that we would build a purely academic education system, K through 12. Everybody would get Algebra 2. Well, that's turned out to be too much of a good thing. The whole education reform movement in K-12 is crashing on Algebra 2. So we need alternative tracks. Again, up comes the tracking issue. But the moral dilemma is when you're dealing with an individual person who is in some difficulty and needs help to take the next step, oftentimes the answer is get job training, not education. Education is too big a bite. So I think you have to live with the fact that the goal is to help people move along from where they are. That means that the BA will be increasingly reserved for affluent white kids. The selective BA already is. So that's a problem. I don't quite know how to solve it because you have the immediate needs of people who are out of work, in trouble. Their next step may be a dangerous one and destructive. We're now seeing an extended period between high school graduation and from an extended period between youth dependency and adult independence. It used to be 18 to 25 when a boy, because that's what the old data did, when a boy could get from 18 at age 25, hit the median hourly wage. That was, from a sociologist's perspective, that was moving from youth dependency to adult independence. That age is now 32. So we've got this new space, and most of what has to happen there is human capital development and work experience. So we've got this new space that we absolutely can't afford in terms of funding it for everybody and moving everybody towards the BA. That is a dilemma. I think it is the next dilemma we face. I think people like CAPSEE and a lot of you have done a remarkably good job. We're not there yet, but bringing training into the education system. The next issue that's up is what about education in the training system?
Yeah, if I could just add, I mean, I think the issue is to get individuals into the workplace and impart that socialization at the workplace builds their own confidence, and to make sure that, you know, if you're doing, you know, training, that you're open to individuals who can make the transition later on, 3 or 4 years after they may work for a while, to come back to the institution and to go into, you know, to increase their education. I think you start where, and the point I think is, you start where the individuals are, and if individuals are coming to us looking for a job, we have to figure out how to get them at least into that kind of, you know, context.
Do I see another question there?
Oh, sure, thanks. Patrick Lane from the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. And this is a question, I think, mainly for Clive. You mentioned that one of the big differences you saw in the data were that non-completers were not scaling back their labor participation as much as completers. And you see a lot of programs around that are pushing people to take more and more credits. That's the key to completion. But were you able to tease anything out as to the why behind that? Is it purely an elective choice, or are people facing, you know, other commitments, life, work, et cetera, that may be preventing them from scaling back?
So that's a good question. We weren't able to tease out why these people were doing this, whether it was layoffs were forcing the people to take less work, or whether it was a conscious decision. I'm focused on my studies. So we weren't able, we could do that, but we didn't do it. So I think there are some related studies that say that you really should be focusing on your studies in order to get through the whole momentum idea, and that certainly comports with these results, but we didn't look at that directly.
Yes? Oh.
Patrick Kelly from Enchimth, Colorado. We've been doing a lot of similar work in 5 or 6 states over the years. And one of the things that really has an impact, particularly when you drop down to sub-baccalaureate level, is mobility. And when you talk about training, it's training for what? Because if you look at regions within states, the availability of jobs varies as much as it does nationally. And these are typically students that are not mobile. So you really have to look at the demand side of the jobs and the supply side in addition to the earnings outcomes. So it's a bigger picture. Comment, if you will. That was more of a statement.
Yeah, not sure that's a point taken. Let's so, why don't we go have another question?
Sure. My name's Kathy Valle. I work for the U.S. House Committee on Education and the Workforce with the minority. So in HEA, career training programs must prepare students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation. There's been conversation about extending this to all degrees across all sectors. So I'm interested to know, you know, given that the degrees or higher education was created, I think for, you know, these maybe different purposes than career training programs were created, would we be ready to transition to this? What are some of the pros and cons? Would love to hear some thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, what you're saying, and I'm glad to hear it, although that is that the major progress we made on this is actually begins with George Bush, people should remember, because we couldn't figure out as a nation what happened to the high school dropouts, and there were stories running around saying they were kidnapped or something. So we dropped a lot of money on putting student records online in computers, and then followed that with Obama dropping $760 million, I think it was, to connect higher education curriculums to wage record data. That is the state longitudinal data system. That, I think, is the spine of the system that's being built. It's available in almost every state except 3 or 4. And the pure answer is we should subject every post-secondary program, whether it's provided by Donald Trump or by Harvard University, to wage record and employment outcome standards. And that will allow us to allow a lot more people in to the production of these programs, not just educators, which is clearly in the air now with the for-profits coming back. But the issue, of course, is we don't have the committee chairman on our side in the House. We've got bipartisan support for this, have had it for a long time. At some point, that coin will drop in the slot, whether it's a state-based system or a national system. It's inevitable. It's coming. So whether we should then subject, I think probably the easy compromise, although I don't see a need to compromise with the education lobby. They're not strong enough on this issue to stop it. But the easy compromise is let the BAs take a walk and just focus this on any program that pretends to do career preparation. Just cut to the nub. I think we should do it for BAs as well, and at least demand transparency, if not gainful employment outcomes.
Yes.
Ann Warren, Hudson County Community College. I would take issue with just kind of accepting the seemingly inevitable status quo. If all this data, and I would agree basically with your conclusions, but going back to some sort of a tracking system and a two-tier education system, that sounds un-American to me, and in a way. And I'm not an idealist saying, okay, we should go just to higher education to study philosophy, and I do understand that people need jobs. I work in an urban community college, and most of my students, you know, are overextended, and they do need jobs. But I think if we know all this information and we have this data, I don't think we should accept that the reality is that a few privileged white kids get opportunities, and the rest of society have certificates and associate's degrees that are not mobile, they're limited in opportunities and limited in income, and that college is only linked to jobs and wages. And I think if we know all this, rather than accepting it, shouldn't we push for reforming the education system? And we know that the way it is right now, it's not working. So we have information, we have data. This is the time to really push for structural education reform, and not just say, we're gonna have a two-tiered system, that's it, can't fix it, just deal with it and accept it. I don't think that's where we should go.
Catherine?
Thank you.
So I'd like to weigh in on this a little bit. I think part of the impediment is that you say we have data, we know all of this. Everyone in this room knows all of this. Everyone outside of this room does not. And that's part of the reason I wanted to talk about some of the disconnect between what the numbers show, what the experts know, and what the general public believes. And I implore you to try to find ways to engage more outside of academia, outside of your institution, and whether that means talking to journalists or writing to newspapers or whatever. But I think really one of the barriers is that the experts know these things. The experts realize that higher education is the route to mobility, is the route to jobs, but, and that there are serious access issues, but the general public does not. Either they don't understand the connection between higher education and earnings potential or mobility, or they don't understand, or even if they know that, they don't realize that lots of Americans don't have those opportunities because they think college is cheap, because they think it's easy to work your way through, and that there aren't these other sort of life obstacles that get in the way, like childcare, for example. So my message to all of you is to try to find ways to talk outside of your institutions, whether they're community colleges or otherwise, excuse me, and engage more with the public, because I think that's really the obstacle.
Okay, we have time for one more question. So.
Dick Romano from the SUNY system in New York State. General versus specific education. Back on that, and Tony and Jim both talked about it. There's a really, I've taught in a community college for 40 years. There's a really strong subset of students, young students, that enter the community college that don't want to do high school over again. They just don't want to do English. They don't want to do history. They don't want to do a lot of the things that you need to get a degree, and they want to connect with the labor market right away. And so I really do agree with you on that. Not everybody, but there's a good, strong subset that does. We need to connect those students with the labor market right away and let them get the general education later if they want a bachelor's degree, okay? So I really do strongly agree with that idea. I'm also really worried about the issue of quality in community colleges, but I don't have a good measure of it, so that's a problem. You know, there's so much of a push to get more credentials and more people out the door with such a high percentage of adjunct faculty in the community college. I mean, the combination of performance-based funding with adjunct faculty could be fatal. I mean, it's just too easy to give everybody an A and get them through there. At least if they get a job, we've got some measure that maybe it had some good. Thanks.
All right, that's many questions there. Maybe we should leave that as the goal to answer some of those questions in the rest of the conference. So why don't we give our panel a... All right, so people always complain that there's not enough time to talk to people. We have too many sessions, and I think we're probably guilty of that, but you do have a half hour now, so please enjoy that. And then there are 3 breakouts, returns to community college, more of the big picture, that's in the Pan American. Now, I think all of these are, you know, through the compliance gauntlet, and then down to those rooms. And then there's returns to short-term stays in community college, that's Statler A/B, returns to technical and vocational programs. So when you're done with that, since we do have a tight schedule, please come back here for lunch at 12. Thank you.